pleasure and privilege being here. Thank you for coming, and for all those who are online. The work that I will be presenting has been done by many people. I've been blessed with a remarkable set of colleagues, students, and collaborators. And in some sense, I'm actually only the spokesperson or the ambassador of a lot of hard work done by many others. And I'm fortunate enough to have worked with them all these years. So this is the outline of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to be, of course, like all of us, we know that anything concerning ecosystems, changes in ecosystems has to do with land use and land cover change. Then on top of that, we have various types of global change, including transformations of nitrogen cycle and the water cycle, but also climate change, which is a very important part of global change. And also water and linear infrastructure, as well as India's commitments to restore tree cover in order to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through additional forest and tree cover, green energy in quotes, and urbanization. So these are themes that will come in and out of all the things I cover. India is a very diverse country, lots of different types of ecosystems, and I will cover a few of them. I'll cover terrestrial ecosystems, some aquatic, as well as some insights coming from more recent work in the urban. So let's look at forests and trees. So like any ecosystem which is dominated by trees is going to be impacted a lot by both temperature and precipitation. So it's important enough to look at what's been happening to India's monsoon, the main driver of the moisture supply to all our ecosystems. So the Indian monsoon has been seeing a sort of a decline since the 1950s. And this decline is not captured by many of the climate models. And so that is being sorted out now by many of our climate scientists. One of the reasons given by many of the scientists working on understanding this decline of the Indian monsoon since the 1950s is that the thermal gradient between the land and sea, which is one of the main drivers of the Indian monsoon. With the warming of the seas, that gradient has weakened. And so as the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, other Bay of Bengal are warming, the gradient between the Tibetan Plateau, the Indian landmass, and the seas has weakened. And so that's one of the hypotheses for the decline of the Indian monsoon. And you can see on the top right-hand corner, parts of India, you can see all the yellows and the reds. Those are the places where this decline is being noticeable. And paradoxically, even as the Indian monsoon seems to have declined low to moderate to slightly higher levels in different parts of the country, the manner in which that precipitation is falling is also been changing. So on the bottom panel, you can see that the rainfall which exceeds 25 mm or more in a day, or 50 mm or more in a day, those two are showing a decline over time. Whereas the rainfall which exceeds 150 mm or more than 200 mm in a day, that part has been increasing. So effectively speaking, the low to moderate packets of rainfall, they are showing a decline, whereas the more high intensity rains have been increasing. Now you would have seen I mean, most of us remember the great Mumbai event, the disaster we had, where about more than 950 millimeters of rainfall fell in a single day in Mumbai. Or more recently, we had about 225 mm of rainfall, which fell in a day and a half in Chennai, far exceeding whatever has been recorded for many, many years. So these are not isolated events. You would have also have heard about the Kedarnath disaster. You would have just a couple of months ago, we had the big floods in Assam, and you can see what has been happening in Pakistan. Terrible, devastating floods. And so this increase in the intensity of rainfall being attributed to climate change, and it's no longer in question. So our ecosystems, whether natural or human dominated or human modified, are all going to be battered by these high intensity rains. And so any of the things that we may have learned about how these ecosystems have been responding to rainfall in the past, some of those may have to be sort of understood again, all over again, simply because we have not had these phenomena as often as possible, as has been seen in the last few decades. So let's just come to a typical seasonally dry forest in India, tree dominated. Bannerghatta, Bandipur, Nagarhole, the Satpuras, or in the Himalayas. And most of these ecosystems have a dry season that lasts anywhere from 3 to 6 months, 5 months, 3 to 5 months in a year. So a dry season means that we don't have much rainfall during that period. So on the y-axis, we have what is known as dry season stream flow, which means that the streams which are coming out of these forested catchments, how much water is flowing in the dry season. So that's what you have on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, we have percentage of tree cover or forest cover, right? So we would have heard in the past from foresters and conservationists that forests are like sponges. They absorb the rainfall in the wet season and release it slowly in the dry season. And therefore, you can have stream flow persisting well into the dry season, or even perennial stream flow in the dry season in some parts of the country, simply because of that sponge effect. However, that sponge effect is only one of 3 possible mechanisms by which forests are responding to in a hydrological sense. So there are 2 key processes that are involved in this. One is that when rain falls, some of it goes into the ground as infiltration and recharges the groundwater. And some of it is going to evaporate directly from the vegetation before it even falls to the ground. And the trees can access through their roots the moisture which is infiltrated into the soil or even the groundwater and release it in the form of transpiration, which is basically the release of water vapor from photosynthetically active vegetation. The leaves, the stomata are open, carbon dioxide goes in, carbon gets fixed, and water vapor comes out. So it's a very important ecophysiological process. Now, which of these 2 processes dominates is shown here. So for example, in the so-called sponge effect, the evapotranspiration arrow is grayish. It's not very dominant. Whereas the infiltration and groundwater recharge is very dominant, which means that it's much higher in magnitude. So whenever that happens, with increase in tree cover, you will see that the stream flow, that dotted line going up. So dry season stream flow might actually increase with increase in forest cover or tree cover. So that's the sponge effect. Then you have the middle line where this infiltration gains to water are balanced by the evapotranspiration losses. So 2 balance each other out. In such a situation, the dry season stream flow from an ecosystem might actually be relatively insensitive to changes in forest cover or tree cover. Then you have the third hypothesis or mechanism, where evapotranspiration, as you can see, is the much more dominant, that black arrow going upwards, and the much more weaker gray arrow of infiltration and groundwater. So evapotranspiration is dominating over infiltration and recharge. When that happens, if you increase tree cover in a catchment, you will actually see a decrease in the dry season stream flow. Now, all of these mechanisms have been seen around the world. For a long time, this evapotranspiration dominated paradigm was found in many of the experimental catchments. But in the last few decades, evidence is mounted for the sponge effect as well. Even though in the traditional popular sense, the sponge effect was the one which was being mentioned most often by conservationists and foresters. And yet the scientific evidence for that has actually come up very recently in the last couple of decades. In the Western Ghats, we actually have the sponge effect happening from work that we did some years back, as well as in the forests of Costa Rica. However, when you plant trees in, say, over in grassland areas or other types of areas, you might actually find that the evapotranspiration dominant mechanism will kick in, and you might actually see a depletion of stream flow. So we have to be careful about the density of trees and where we put what type of trees and where we put them in pursuance of our national goals for example, covering 33% of our area with tree cover or forest cover. That's a national goal. Also, India's targets, carbon targets, which are quite ambitious and involve possibly over 30 million hectares. So we will be transforming land in one form or the other. And so we need to be careful about how we do that. Because you might actually have a trade-off between your carbon benefits and your hydrologic services. So here is at a slightly larger scale. This on the left-hand side, we have work which we did in central India, where we looked at rice paddies. And imagine that rice paddies are some of these agricultural areas which are going to get abandoned or converted into tree plantations as a thought experiment with direct measurements as well as modeling. So we actually found that as you increase the tree cover up to a threshold, the hydrologic benefits increase. But when you cross a particular threshold of tree cover or tree density in the landscape, then the evapotranspiration demands of the trees, as well as a loss of the detention storage of paddy fields. Remember, paddy fields also they're like a wetland, they store moisture. And so when you convert that into tree plantations, you're going to lose that detention storage benefit, plus you're going to have additional evapotranspiration from the fast growing trees. And so you will then possibly start descending on this line, which means that then you will start seeing a net reduction in your water yield or groundwater. On the right-hand side is a very nice piece of work done in subhumid Africa, where again, they have looked at the groundwater recharge in millimeters per year. And then you have canopy cover and tree density in hectares. And then if you see all these colored lines, that's the percentage of the roots which are below 1.5 meters. So you'll see that we quickly achieve the threshold depending on what percentage of the roots are below 1.5 meters. If a large percentage of the trees that you're planting, their roots go below 1.5 meters, you're going to achieve this threshold of very quickly. So you need to think about the density of trees that you're planting, especially in subhumid and semi-arid areas. So between these two pieces of work, one done in central India, the other done in Africa, this in some sense provides us with a good sort of a thumb rule for the transformation of India's ecosystems, which are currently not dominated by trees. And whether they are going to be abandoned agricultural land or they're going to be some other types of ecosystems which are currently called degraded, when we start all grasslands, which are actually have a merit of their own, but unfortunately are sometimes considered as wastelands and are targeted for tree planting, we have to be careful about the investment that we make in trees in these areas, because it could lead to this this threshold being crossed. And once we do that, the benefits to local communities and to the ecosystems in terms of the hydrology is going to be compromised for possibly short-term carbon gains. And I'll tell you why it might be short-term carbon gains in a little while. So here is, okay, so that's about at the ecosystem scale or the catchment scale. Now, what is likely to happen to our individual trees? under climate change. So here is some really nice work done by friend and colleagues in IIHS Pune, where they looked at a bunch of trees, over 40 species of Indian trees. And they looked at something called this function, which you see on the y-axis. It simply means the ability of a leaf to function, nothing else. It's just a complicated name. And Ficus religiosa, which all of us know, is a people. Mango, very important culturally and nutritionally, and for all of us enjoy mangoes. So just these two species, you can see that the leaf functions fall precipitously after a particular threshold temperature is reached. So in the case of Ficus religiosa, it's somewhat about 46, 47 degrees Celsius. But fortunately for us, our mango seems to be much more resilient to increases in these high temperatures. The other thing to point out is that if you've seen a tree which is exposed to ambient temperature, you will see sun specks on many leaves. So even if the ambient temperature is close to 50 degrees Celsius, some of the leaves are exposed to much higher temperatures, about 3 or 4 degrees Celsius more, because they get direct sun specks on them, which means that you will have mortality, you will have losses. So in some sense, this is a very conservative way of estimating what might happen to some of our trees as warming continues. And this group, Deepak Barwa's group in IIHS Pune, they have looked at a bunch of deciduous and evergreen species of trees, about 40 plus. And this is the beginning of our understanding of what might happen to India's really ambitious goal of reforesting or planting trees over many millions of hectares. We have to take into account the resilience of many of these species to these climate shocks that are happening with rapidity. So then how should we choose the trees that we may want to invest in? Because we may love all our native species, we would love a nice mixed forest everywhere, or with lots of biodiversity and so on. But unfortunately, not all of them are going to cope very well with the type of climate shocks, severe droughts that are happening with the increasing frequency in many parts of the country. So this work done by colleagues in National Center for Biological Sciences, Mahesh Shankar and his group, suggests that tree species, deciduous tree species with large seeds and low stem specific density, basically low wood density, show greater survival under drought. Now, this is very important. So if you want to invest in tree planting in areas which are subject to increasing drought under current as well as future climate change, you might want to draw upon species that meet these criteria of having a low wood density and having large seeds, because there is evidence here that should be used in our planting programs. So we are just beginning to understand what might be happening to some of our tree species, and we have so many different species that we don't know much about. Okay, we did talk about evapotranspiration. Yes, it does come at the cost of dry season stream flow. It goes into the atmosphere, but it's not disappearing anywhere. Any water vapor that goes up into the atmosphere is going to come back in one form or the other as precipitation. So this is what is known as the green water flux. So when you have large tracts of forests, such as in the Western Ghats or Central India, when they evapotranspire, in some sense, they're like a pump. So if you see in the evergreen forests in the Western Ghats, even during the rainless period, a lot of the soil moisture and groundwater which has accumulated in the wet season is pumped out into the atmosphere. And this continues even during the wet season. But of course, in the wet season, there's also rainfall happening. So it doesn't happen with the same intensity, but it happens during certain periods. So until recently, we used to think that, we have our very fragmented forests and thin slivers of forests here and there. So the recycling of evapotranspiration as rainfall, which was well known in large forested areas like the Amazon, does it even occur in Indian forests? Until some years back, we were not very sure, but now there is evidence. For example, this work done by Spracklin in 2012 suggested that some parts of India, even though this is a global level study, it put many of our forested areas where if a air parcel or a cloud is passing over a forested area, it has twice or more moisture than air which is not exposed to vegetation. So that's where these points which you see, those stippled points are. Basically, the clouds are gaining moisture as they pass over the forest, and then that bounty of rainfall may fall in some other areas. And then more recently, this work done by groups in IIT Mumbai on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side is our own work where we looked at how much pumping of transpiration, evapotranspiration is done by the forests of the Western Ghats. Not just the forests, the coffee plantations, and many other tree-dominated systems. And then some of that moisture, which is pumped into the atmosphere by the vegetation, is transferred, it comes back as rainfall in Tamil Nadu, in the drier parts of Tamil Nadu. Now, this is a completely different take on the dispute between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu in terms of moisture transfer. So we need to really, and it's also very difficult to quantify this, convert this into an economic value. I mean, rainfall coming in a dry area, I mean, you would think that must be a lot of benefit. So the Western Ghats ecosystem services have been undervalued. Even though it's a World Heritage Site, it has some fantastic biodiversity hotspots. It's the origin of many of our great rivers for peninsular India. But this is a phenomenon that has not yet been taken into account. Now, coming from peninsular India and the Western Ghats to the Himalayas, this is a lovely photograph taken by Sandesh Kadur. This is one of our sites in Sikkim and the Shingba Rhododendron Sanctuary. And Himalayas are at the frontier of climate change, both in terms of warming as well as changes in precipitation. And actually, they have some of the highest rates of warming compared to many other regions in the world. So we did a study some years back where we looked at all pantropical mountains from the Cordilleras in the Americas to the East African mountains, to the Himalayas, and then the Southeast Asian mountains. And we found this consistent response of these tropical mountains to warming and heat stress. So what we found is what is known as a loss of temperature positivity, which basically means, I mean, you would think that trees growing up in a place where snow falls and it gets cold in winter, they would be very happy with warming. But actually, the many parts of the Himalayas do have a dry season. And in the dry season, with increasing warming, they are actually under moisture stress and temperature heat stress as well. So we actually see a browning of some parts of the Himalayas over the last, especially in the 90s. And in 1999, which was 98, 99 was an El Nino year, the forests of the Western Himalayas, typically, you would think that the monsoon rain is very important for these broadleaved oak forests in the Western Himalayas. But actually, no matter how much it rains during the wet season, if you don't have sufficient rain from October to May, which includes what is known as winter precipitation, then these oak forests and other broadleaf trees, they come under severe temperature and moisture stress. And that's what happened. The ground measurements in Uttarakhand corroborated what we have found from remote sensing and other studies, that there was a loss of foliar biomass, photosynthetic ability, all of that happened in 98, 99. So we're going to possibly see this sort of double whammy in the Western Himalayas. You have these cloudbursts and these huge intensive events of rainfall like the Kedarnath and other And then you're going to have these fairly more intense dry summers, winter and summers coming. And that might be a big stress on these ecosystems. Is that, so I have to get that part that is hidden, something that we can do. If not, I can just, no. Okay, great, that's great. I think we can keep it on top only, I think. Yeah, so basically just want to say that the Himalayas have some of the highest trends in terms of warming and so on. But the amplitude of the annual phenological cycle has been less. The increase in the amplitude, that is the seasonality within a year from say the most greenest part of the year to the driest part of the year, that amplitude has not been increasing as much as in some of the other pantropical mountains. So this resilience of the Western Himalayas and other Himalayas, how long it will last, we are not aware, but this is what our evidence shows. Just changing is. Test. Okay, great. Thanks. This is another piece of work done by a student that was working with us, a student of Subimal Ghosh in IIT Mumbai, Don Sebastian. And I just want to draw your attention to the Western Himalayas, where you can see the limiting variables in different forest regions at different temporal scales. Just let's look at interannual. And you can see that the Western Himalayas is the only one where winter precipitation is very pronounced. I mean, if you see the interannual variability across the central Indian forests, the Eastern Himalaya, Northeastern Hills, Southwestern Ghats, you don't see winter rainfall playing an important role. So winter rainfall and what happens to winter rainfall or post-monsoonal rainfall in the Western Himalayas is going to determine the future of those forests. Here is the greening and browning atlas of India, which we have been trying to work on. Basically, you take the last few decades, divide India into pixels, you use remotely sensed and climate data, and you look at which parts of India have been greening and which parts have been browning. Now, greening is not necessarily always good. I'm sure you know that. And browning is not necessarily always bad. So we may get a map like this, and then it's up to us for the stakeholders and those of us who want to understand the mechanisms and the people who are going to be impacted by this greening and browning to try to interpret this in various ways. So for example, the greening could be because of changes in climate, increase in precipitation, or whatever. Browning could be because of temperature stress or reduction in rainfall. Browning could also be because we have pumped out all the groundwater and some parts of India are showing depletion of groundwater. And so you might have to change the cropping pattern or do something else. That will also show up as browning. So this is now being generated for the whole country. And we are now going to hopefully be able to put this up. And then with the help of stakeholders, scientists, citizen scientists, communities across the country to look at the greening and browning trend in their vicinity and then tell us, okay, this is because of what they think. First of all, a corroboration of what we have found, and two, understanding what might be involved there. Is it a change in cropping pattern? Is it because of moisture stress on the forests? Is it because of tree plantations coming in? Is it because of frequent forest fires? Is it because of large-scale landslides or deforestation? And whatever, there could be various reasons. There could also be invasive species like Prosopis or Lantana coming in, and you'll find greening happening. So greening is not necessarily always to be seen as a positive thing. It can have synergies and trade-offs with ecosystem services. Here is one invasive species. This is wattle, black wattle, in the Upper Nilgiris, also found in the Palni Hills. And this has basically replaced grassland. So now, remember the graph where we showed about the infiltration and evapotranspiration trade-off? Here you're planting grassland, which has got much less evapotranspiration to begin with trees whose evapotranspiration is going to only increase as they grow. And so they have been depleting the subsoil moisture and the groundwater, reducing the inflow of water into the hydropower reservoirs in the Nilgiris. And so, and of course, they're also doing one more thing. They're also fixing a lot of carbon. So you have here a trade-off. Here's an invasive alien species. It doesn't belong to India. It was brought in and introduced, and it has now spread. It has replaced the grasslands. It has displaced some of the native biodiversity. And now we have a lot of carbon. And now the government of Tamil Nadu has taken a policy decision that we must restore as much of this as back to the original vegetation of grasslands. So you are going to lose some of the carbon. You might have gained some hydrologic benefits. But as you know, this has been happening over many decades. So clearing wattle over large, especially over steep slopes and so on, is going to cause a lot of disturbance to the soil, also soil erosion. So there are other trade-offs involved. So ecological restoration is quite complex. We may wish away wattle, but it's not going to go. It's the same with water hyacinth in our water bodies, or many of our other, invasive species of fish, for example, which have come into our rivers, lakes, and streams. This is not an easy solution. So we are going to possibly see some novel ecosystems dominated by invasive species, novel or modified ecosystems, whatever you want to call them, and we'll have to probably adapt to them or regulate them or manage them. So this is something that's happening in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is one of the first states to actually have a policy on management of invasive tree species for black wattle, for lantana, and for Prosopis. And this is our work in the Upper Nilgiris. So when we're measuring transpiration in these wattle trees, this is just one number we have, about 5 liters per hour on average. And so compared to grasslands, grasses which are shallow rooted, where transpiration is much less, we can then start quantifying what might be the gains from clearing some 1 hectare of wattle back to grassland, right? So that's just, and then we have to make sure that we don't lose the soil, we don't do other things that might be more damaging than good. So sometimes it's better, as they say, perfection should not be the enemy of the good. So in this case, we have to tread with caution when we have to transform large areas which have been invaded by these species. Also, wattle is a nitrogen fixing tree. And so it has transformed the nitrogen cycle in the Upper Nilgiris. And you can see that wherever you have maximum invasive cover, you have these quite much higher levels of nitrate going out through these streams. So this is another thing that we have to think about. It's changed the carbon cycle, it's changed the nitrogen cycle, and it's changed the hydrologic cycle. So when we think of transforming this back to some so-called earlier ecosystem, which we may never be able to attain exactly, we have to think about the of how what should be our goals in terms of new sets of ecosystem services that we would like to have in the future. This is a decision that has to be made by people, and of course, the ecosystems can't decide for themselves, but we have to decide on their behalf as well. So now from terrestrial ecosystems, let's look at some of the things that are happening to our rivers and aquatic systems. And I would like to start with pointing out that we have these very fantastic 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And like many other countries, India has signed off on them. We use these as ways of looking at the progress of individual states, of the country as a whole. And I would like to point out goal number 14, called Life Below Water. Now that's exclusively based on marine ecosystems. So it has nothing to do with freshwater ecosystems. Then you have life on land, which is again terrestrial ecosystems. There is no equivalent for freshwater aquatic systems, even though the freshwater biome is one of the most threatened globally. Our rivers and wetlands have been transformed and degraded, and they are so important for many of our ecosystem services and biodiversity, and yet they don't merit a sustainable development goal like the terrestrial ones and the marine systems have managed to get themselves in. There must have been some particular imperative why this has happened. Possibly, I mean, when I was discussing this with the IPCC colleagues, possibly because many countries didn't want to sign off on conservation of rivers and wetlands, because that's the ones that you want to transform for hydropower generation, for irrigation, and for many other things that you want to do. However, the conservation of freshwater ecosystems is a target under, for example, clean water and sanitation, which is goal number 6. It's also on life on land also has a target for freshwater ecosystems. But those are targets. And when you have a goal called clean water and sanitation, Bengaluru's clean water and sanitation can come out of the Kaveri, or it can come from far away Linganamaki Reservoir, which would be, you would be, meeting your sustainable development goal of clean water and sanitation, but at the cost of another robbing water from another riverine ecosystem. So this, in some sense, the way the sustainable development goals have been set up by omitting freshwater ecosystems as a sustainable development goal has set into motion at the international scale, in some sense, a handicap for the sustainable management of our aquatic ecosystems. So this is basically looking at our rivers. These are artisanal fishers in the Ganga in Bihar, and free-flowing rivers, and the floods that sustain them, the sediment that is very integral, are very important for this bounty of fish, which is very important source of protein security. And also these are native acquired biodiversity in some sense. These fish are native fish. Much of our fish now comes from aquaculture farms. It comes from reservoirs. And so the connect between free-flowing rivers and protein security of people has been disrupted to a great extent. And so if we want to have a stake of people back in free-flowing rivers, we have to think about fisheries, capture fisheries, reviving them, and the communities that are engaged with them. If they become stakeholders, then there will be a political constituency for the maintenance of rivers as free-flowing entities. Right now, there are not enough stakeholders for that. Everybody wants the water for one thing or the other. And another thing that we have found out is, this was known from the Mekong much earlier, but now there's evidence from India, from the Ganga, after looking at about 20 years of fisheries data in Bihar, that the big floods, which are linked to La Niñas or Indian Ocean dipole, every few years you get this big flood in the Ganga, then you have a bounty of fish. So that big flood is really important, and more than 50% of the variability in fish catch can be attributed to this interannual variability in these big floods. So having floods is a part of the ecology of rivers and floodplains. And of course, they also sustain some of our most remarkable biodiversity, aquatic biodiversity, like the Gangetic gharial. This is a smooth-coated otter sleeping on an island in the Vikramshila Dolphin Sanctuary. Some years back, I was lucky to see. Here is a picture I took of the Gangetic river dolphin, India's national aquatic animal, also found in Bangladesh. And you can see that this is one species of an aquatic mammal, which is done reasonably well in close proximity to human use. But until recently, when you have transformations beyond a certain point, then species which have actually done pretty well living with people may just fall through the cracks, as we shall see. So we have found that with increased mechanization of boat traffic, you know that the aquatic, our river dolphin, Gangetic river dolphin, it has vestigial eyes, no eyes. It basically uses echolocation sonar to locate its prey, to navigate through the river channels. So when you have mechanized boat traffic of high density going through these waterways, which has replaced the traditional boats, then that interferes with the ability of the dolphin to effectively seek prey and to navigate. And so they have to try extra hard to find prey and move around. So when you have more mechanized boats with underwater noise, then the dolphins have to try extra hard. When you have to do something extra hard, then you are spending metabolic energy, which would have otherwise been used for something for growing and so on. It's going to come at a cost to our body, and so for the dolphin's body. So, and when you combine that with low flows, then the effect of the boat traffic, underwater noise, becomes much more pronounced. And this results in a metabolic stress, which is basically can be making it very difficult for the river dolphins to persist in some of these areas. So the conversion of the Ganga into a waterway with high levels of mechanized boat traffic, if that plan goes the way it is, and if the densities are very high, it might be something that has been with us for many millions of years. And India's national aquatic animal, we might just lose them simply because deceptively it's living in close proximity to humans, done very well. But then look at what happened to the passenger pigeon, or even to the precipitous decline. Look at our vultures. There used to be millions over the skies, and then we had only a few hundred left after the devastating decline in the 90s. So this is something to think about. We also have another dolphin. This is the Indus River dolphin. Now, the Indus River dolphin has now become a new species. Scientists who compare the Gangetic River dolphin and the Indus River dolphin declare the Indus River dolphin as a new species. Now, there's a healthy population in Pakistan in the Indus River system. But the population in India is about maybe between 10 and 15. So it is the rarest mammal in India. And the only part of India in which we have the Indus River dolphin is the Bias Conservation Reserve, which is downstream of the Pong Dam and upstream of the Harike Barrage. So unless in the future we actually have cooperation with Pakistan, and they get our gharials and we get their Indus River dolphins, or something like that, or a shared understanding of how rivers need to be managed for ecological flows. I mean, that's a pretty tall order that we're thinking about, but it's a very vulnerable population. And so what we did is we looked at how the management of the Pong Dam, as well as the demands on that water for various human uses and the SDGs that are involved, and also how that translates into the extinction risk for such a small population of an Indus River dolphin, which can, because of stochastic factors, because of some shock, or some change in the sex ratio, whatever happens, with such a small population is highly vulnerable to extinction. And so we have a series of climate models and also the management of the pond dam. And then we have looked at the probability of extinction of the Indus River dolphin under these scenarios. There are, of course, opportunities as well for our regulated river systems. The Gangetic River is a regulated river. There's a barrage on the Indo-Nepal border. It's one of the important tributaries of the Ganga. And yet, the stretch of the Gangetic below the barrage at Valmiki Nagar, the Tribeni barrage, is a biodiversity hotspot. You have one of the 5 spots on the globe where gharials are breeding. You have river dolphins, you have freshwater turtles, you have artisanal fishers, you have riparian grasslands, and it's a jewel. And interestingly, it's a highly regulated system. There's water which is released from the barrage for irrigation. And yet what we found was that often the canals are shut for repairs. And then in those years, sometimes for 2-3 years, the water from the barrage goes straight into the river downstream. So you have this ecological bounty, hydro-ecological bounties coming in once in a few years. Plus, the farmers are not using all the water that's supplied to them from the canals. A lot of it ends up coming back into the river. And so we have a regulated river system, which is actually a biodiversity hotspot. And so that gives us hope that with some management and some changes, some shifts in water use, we could achieve a whole lot. What we found from our modeling and our measurements of flow is that if you have 1,000 hectares in this entire Gangetic basin, if you just transform 1,000 hectares of intensive agriculture from sugarcane to some other crop, we would gain about 4 cubics of water in the dry season in the Gangetic. And that is really nice based on what we know about the low flows in the Gangetic. And so I think that our regulated river systems have to be an integral part of the future of our aquatic biodiversity and artisanal fisheries. We have to find ways and means of having some shifts in agriculture combined with alternative ways of managing our dams and barrages for sustaining these, because many of our rivers are regulated. We don't have any so-called pristine rivers left, except in the Northeast. So we have to work with all these sectors, agriculture, the irrigation department, in order to put back more water into our rivers. Also, this is just to show that I was telling you that that evidence on floods sustaining fisheries in the Mekong was very strong, but now we have that evidence from the Ganga. So these floods that they do cause some devastation, but they also are very important for sustaining the fisheries. As we had very massive goals for transformation of our land for sequestering carbon and generating carbon stocks, the other commitment India has made is to transform India's energy from fossil fuels dependence to renewables. And some of that comes under small hydro. It's a small part, and you would think that small hydro must be green. Unfortunately, when we looked at these streams in the Western Ghats, small hydro projects, less than 25 megawatts of power, tend to be located in the headwater streams, which means that the endemic fish species which are found there are the ones which are going to be hit hard. So the series of work that we have done in the Western Ghats, and there are other people who have done this similar work in Himachal Pradesh, where even local communities have been protesting against small hydro for social and cultural as well as ecological reasons. So when we call something as green energy, I think we need to be a little careful. If it has to pass the test of being called green energy, it must not be having a negative impact on biodiversity or ecosystem services. And that holds true for other forms of energy as well. So I just go back. Okay. Now, this was about water infrastructure. We talked about dams, barrages, and so on. But there's another big change which is happening in our aquatic systems, which it has just overwhelmed us in the last few decades, is the invasive species coming in. So here is a checkered keelback, a native snake, in a water body in Bengaluru, trying to devour a tilapia, which is from Africa. We actually left the snake in peace, but some of my snake expert friends said probably this snake may not have been able to manage this particularly large meal. So when you have invasive species coming in, they can transform the size class distribution of fish in a water body, which means that some of the aquatic biodiversity like water snakes or turtles and other fish may not always make it. So we have to be careful about what these invasive species are doing. They're there. So we have to harvest them. We have to use them for human use also, because otherwise, how do you regulate it? So invasive species management is going to become an important agenda for the next few decades. And here are the series of invasive species of fish which have come into our river systems. And when you have interlinking of rivers, you're interlinking rivers with different levels of pollution, different levels of geologies, and different levels of invasive species which have come in. So you're going to basically end up, piranha have been biting people. All sorts of things are being reported from various parts of the country. So this is another global change with invasive species, both plants we talked about, blackwattle, prosopis, lantana, but also about fish. So this is something that we have to think about. How do we manage this? We can't get rid of all of them. Do we then use them in management? We target them for human consumption. What do we do? How do you do that? And how do we gradually bring back our native fish? And remember, a lot of this has happened deliberately. Our aquaculture and our fisheries folks have been responsible for spreading some of these invasive species throughout our rivers and wetlands. So finally, coming to the urban infrastructure challenges. And why should we, when we're talking about such diverse ecosystems, the Western Ghats and the Satpuras and the Himalayas, why should we think about the urban, which don't? I mean, you would know that urban areas may not have a huge percentage of the biodiversity or generate ecosystem services. Then why are we talking about that? Because for two reasons. One, urbanization and urban spaces, they have an impact on ecosystems far away from them. So if you look at what's been happening to linear infrastructure across the country, it's partly because of driven by urbanization. So that's reason number one. So we need to understand what urbanization and urban areas are doing to other ecosystems, and then all the feedbacks and linkages between them. So we need this continuum from the semi-wild all the way to mega cities for us to really find solutions for some of these problems. Two, urban areas do have the ability to sustain biodiversity. I mean, Bengaluru has 233 species of birds, or Delhi might have 300 plus. Actually, there are slender lorises in 3 or 4 pockets within Bengaluru. You take Chennai, Delhi, the Solar Sanctuary, the Yamuna floodplains. Urban biodiversity has somehow managed, in spite of lots of hits and misses, it is still a very rich and thriving opportunity for us. It's not going to solve the overall biodiversity crisis, but it's possibly, under certain circumstances, it might even end up as refuge for certain biodiversity that might otherwise be threatened in some other places. So here is some work that we did for the Western Ghats in central India, where we looked at linear infrastructure and how that is impeding movement of many species this was targeted at wild mammals like sambar, elephant, and bear, and so on. And we found that if you have 400 meters of linear infrastructure per square kilometer, then you have the movement is impeded in that particular area. And if you have about 200 meters of linear infrastructure per square kilometer, then the movement is reduced considerably. So either impeded or reduced considerably. So this linear infrastructure actually occupies a very small percentage of that landscape, but it can cut off a large part of that area and fragment it effectively. So this is basically something that we need to be thinking about very carefully. that was one type of linear infrastructure in terrestrial ecosystems. Now we have two very important transformations of where the river systems themselves are being, in some sense, converted into linear infrastructure. You have the waterways which are being planned. There's the Ganga waterway and then many other waterways. They have many other issues facing them in terms of feasibility and all of that. But just to say that the waterways are going to be, in some sense, making it difficult for species such as the Gangetic dolphin, the Indian skimmer, or the ghadial, because they need river islands, they need sandbanks, they need free-flowing water, and we saw about the effect of underwater noise on the river dolphins before. So we have to think about how we can mitigate this, if it is possible. So here are some of the things that might happen because of converting some of rivers into waterways. You need to do a lot of dredging. Many of our rivers have been the recipient of over a few hundred years of pollution and contaminants from industrialization, urbanization, and agriculture. So those, and also they contain geogenic, contaminants and pollutants like arsenic, which are natural in some parts, like for example in Bihar and West Bengal. So when you dredge sediment from the bottom of a river in order to create a channel, you might be ending up releasing the pollutants like arsenic into the water. So that is a danger for human health, especially of people who are doing fishing there or who are engaging in boat traffic and coming in contact with that water. And of course, we already talked about the effect that boat traffic can have on river dolphins. So this 10 to 12 million people who depend on river fisheries across the Ganga-Brahmaputra basin, these are, in some sense, a dwindling stakeholder in free-flowing rivers. And of course, the rest, those of us who are in the conservation side of things, I mean, we are a very small number compared to that. And we are hoping that they would remain stakeholders in free-flowing rivers, because it's only along with them that some stretches of rivers can be maintained for all these ecosystem services. So this is just to show the scale and intensity of the transformations that are being planned. This is the interlinking of rivers, which is going to transfer so-called surplus water from one basin to water deficient basins. And a couple of things to just mention, that surplus for whom and for what. Any water which is considered surplus forms a particular function in that river basin. It can be mobilizing sediment, it can be sustaining a fishery. We talked about how the floods are important for sustaining fisheries. So really calling some water surplus or deficient is something that we have to think about. Plus, these basins are not, the climate is not carved into stone. The climate is going to change. Areas which are considered now more moist and dry now, are they going to get transformed? So these are some of the things that we have to think about. This is another example where green energy is in conflict with the, we have only 150 individuals left of the Great Indian Bustard. And the decline of the Great Indian Bustard has nothing to do with renewable energy. It's just that all sorts of factors are involved in bringing it to the brink of extinction. But with such small numbers, the semi-arid and desert habitats where the Great Indian Bustard is found is coming into conflict with so-called green energy. And if this energy has to be called green, whether it's a windmill or a solar farm and the power lines that go along with it, we have to rethink the term. It's certainly not green if it's going to cause the extinction of the last remaining Great Indian Bustard, a magnificent bird. Okay, what about urban biodiversity? So you have a greater short-nosed fruit bat, you have the grey hornbill, both in Bengaluru, and urbanization has a very fine-scale impact on biodiversity. You have these empty lots which have got trees growing on them, you have shrubs and grasses, and then suddenly they get built over and you have big losses. And two, both these species, at least in observations that I made, they couldn't really persist. For example, these two greater short-nosed fruit bats they couldn't find a roosting place in our apartment complex. They abandoned it after a while. This hornbill was also looking for large trees, looking for a mate actually, and so I mean, it's in some sense you can call it adaptation, but certainly it's the absence of a tree that makes a hornbill seek a perch like that. Yet urban biodiversity has the possibility to thrive and persist. Here are two species, the coppersmith barbet and the white-cheeked barbet, both found in various parts of Bengaluru. Both are frugivores as adults. Both are cavity nesters, which means that they need trees of a certain size where cavities can be formed and which are fruiting. So you can see the distribution of these two species, the white-cheeked barbet being much more widespread throughout Bengaluru. So we will have to think about how we can conserve urban biodiversity in very novel ways. Again, 3 species of owls, all not very far from home. Barn owl, regular visitor to some of our apartments. It needs particular types of building design in order to persist. And the rats and bandicoots that are produced by our garbage, sustained by our garbage, helps the barn owl persist whereas the spotted owlet can also do pretty well, but it needs some open and trees of certain kind in the close vicinity to buildings, which are not. So that I think I'm confident that we will retain that. The Scops owl is going to need these campuses, whether it's the National Center for Biological Sciences, the GKVK campus, Lal Bagh perhaps, or other few areas. These campuses are actually the refugia for species like that. Now, here's the shikra on the left and a kestrel on the right. And my bets are on the shikra persisting in Bengaluru in the next few decades. We're going to lose the kestrel for many parts of Bengaluru. It needs open spaces. And so it's a sad thing for predicting the local extinction of species from various parts of Bengaluru. But only if we can make that prediction quantitatively, then we can do something about it. So the persistence of peri-urban agriculture, some form of open space areas where species such as the Eurasian kestrel can come every winter and continue to enrich Bengaluru is something that we have to work towards. I also, again, 2 species of munias, the scaly-breasted munia found large parts of Bengaluru, but the tricolored munia only in some parts of Bengaluru. So again, we have to think about what we can do to keep the tricolored munia, and you can see that it's on a jowar. So maybe peri-urban agriculture could be the way of keeping species such as the tricolored munia within the munia family to persist in Bengaluru. And urban biodiversity to both persist and thrive will need a little bit of help. So we'll need, for example, this bee hotel for solitary bees, or a roosting box for bats, insectivorous bats, or that nesting box for owls. These are things that we may have to invest in if we have to help urban biodiversity survive. So on that hopeful note, thank you for listening, and we can have some questions.
And they built a smart city around my house, and it floods within 15 minutes, or maybe even less than that. So I really don't know who's smarting our India, but there really needs to be a. It's like you're explaining it in very realistic terms, technically, but on ground, the urbanization, I'm not really sure whether it'll work and how long it is going to smart India the way it's supposed to be, smarting us.
Yeah, I really don't know. Yeah, please.
I have a different kind of question. You have done so much of work. Many of you have done so much of work and collected information, studies, all that. But today the country doesn't have to have a parliament working. Government is confusion. No planning commission. So does the government of India, the rulers, the decision makers, understand or accept or respect the work you have done, and are they making use of it anyway for the country's benefit? How do you explain?
It's a pretty tough one. And I think that that citizen, in some sense, the role of citizens' voices, not necessarily only translated through legislative parliamentary elections, but through collective understanding and collective voice. Maybe that would be one thing that we may have to mobilize when if other institutions and other mechanisms are not responding. And this has happened before. We have passed through difficult periods, different crises, in the 60s, food famine and droughts and many other things, war. So many transformations have happened. And I think that we have had a tradition of very robust civil society organizations, whether in Bengaluru or in other places. And I think that's at least one way in which certainly we can't, this is something that we can engage with without any problems. Ultimately, I think that could possibly tilt the balance. And maybe at some point it might translate into political will also. Maybe.
Sir, in just continuing is this one question. Actually, the new act is coming for Bangalore City. Most of you are aware of it. And there is a area council working at the area level, and we have a ward council working at the ward level, and we have a ward committee working at the constituency level. This three democratically established institutions are not strengthened, because most of us are not aware of this. Maybe any of you have attended any of these meetings? No. See, this is where it is happening at the local ward level. And there is one clause in that act stating that all the biodiversity to be protected, and there's one clause in that particular act. So if we try to strengthen this local institutions where community participation is much more, I felt IIHS should be a part of this conservation committee, which is mandated in this act. So I request IIHS to come into this conservation where you can have people for all these 243 wards which has come in Bangalore. It is mandated. So it's as per law. So if you can just come and participate there also, no, you can just do all this mapping, all this work. And most of them are there at the community level, but they don't get an opportunity to participate. Maybe there will be a political reason. No, we'll not go into political aspect. Only thing, as per act and mandate, you got a place to come and sit there in that particular area and talk about conservation. You can talk about the environment. You can talk about this species, rare species, which are all there in that particular this one. Even lakes are there. So development of lakes, it's all possible, sir. I think so. You have to create a platform for this, and I feel IIHS can come forward and look into the aspects.
That is definitely very positive and also very hopeful engagement that we should all try our best to do.
I come from Assam, and the place I belong to, it's a shore area, like river islands, and in last 10 years, the erosion is erosion has been very frequent due to climate change and all. So we are facing the real effect of climate change. But my concern is that it's a regular phenomenon if we take it loosely. And but what we saw this year in Borak Valley, in Silchar town, basically. So people complains that because of those dams and all, the Silchar town faced a huge flood. And so my question is that, whenever you build, lots of dams are being built, in different riverine areas in Assam. My question is that whenever you build a dam on the embankment of the rivers, the community people and many climate action activists, they often complain that, they, who builds and who designs the dams, they don't engage the community and don't apply the community knowledge regarding response to the climate change and all. So I want to know your observation on that, and thank you for this beautiful presentation, and particularly for the photos and all.
Thank you. Yes, we did need dams. I mean, we built dams and we transformed rivers. We generated hydropower that's required. The green revolution was a result of many of these transformations. But now we have about 50, 60 years of experience with dams. And we now are finding that the role of dams as flood control agents is something that is now being questioned, and their ability to cope with the type of changes in the rainfall regime, whether we take the Kerala floods in 2018, or we take some of the devastating, what they call as cloudbursts and other things in Uttarakhand, or the recent Assam floods, where some dams have been implicated in some sense enhancing the hazard and as well as causing more devastation. Bansagar Dam, for example, was implicated some years back by the Chief Minister of Bihar for causing floods in Bihar, when actually it wasn't really raining much in Bihar, but the sudden release of water from Bansagar Dam resulted so dams are now increasingly coming under scrutiny. We have to rethink ways and means of managing them so that the risk to downstream communities is minimized. Early warning systems are in place. Plus, if we are going to manage them in different ways, then we have to think about whether, as a co-benefit, we can also improve the ecology of the downstream rivers, maybe revive artisanal fisheries and so on. The other more complex thing is the floodplain itself. We have treated floodplains as areas like any other part of the country where we can go and build and towns and cities and houses but especially with climate change, even earlier floodplains were very dynamic. We just didn't respect that well enough. So channelizing rivers with embankments, especially rivers which are prone to large-scale movement, I think we may have to rethink that as well. Which? Yeah, I'm not an expert in organic farming. Actually, I wish there were a few other colleagues. I think Chandni has just left, but there are, clearly agriculture which is uses less chemicals, which we know is harmful to us as well as the ecology, would be great. And also there's the question of scale. And I think that there have been some successes, and many states are promoting organic farming, whether the state of Sikkim, for example, or even in Tamil Nadu, there is a policy to promote organic farming. It seems to work with a certain size of farm, certain types of, possibly richer farmers with a slightly larger land holding. So there are some challenges so it will need a lot of support. And a lot of R&D, just like the R&D that fueled the green revolution, the chemical intensive, you also need very good R&D and extension support for farmers who might want to experiment with and take risks with organic farm.
Yeah, hi, Jagdish, we have around 11 questions online. Mm-hmm. Should I bunch them up into groups of 3 and read them out to you? Yes. All right, the first question is by Varsha. They ask, I was curious regarding your long-term urban ecological investigation lab in Bangalore and the goals of this lab. The second question is from Professor Jagannatha Venkatramaya. Why is a review since UNCED 1992 on climate action and biodiversity not covered in your papers? Please enlighten if any. And the third question is, what is your take on the effects of urban linear infrastructure, especially the water pipelines on the freshwater ecosystems, which take up water from water sources and dump it somewhere, thereby changing the water cycle and also changing the feedback and linkages within the ecosystem.
Yeah. So the first one was on the long-term urban ecological observatory. So we have, the goals of that are basically to understand the changing environment and ecology of urban and peri-urban areas in Bengaluru. So we have a 54-acre site. And then it is basically has a border with a reserve forest. It has a water body on one side. And plus on campus itself, we have constructed ponds. We have some planting of native species. And we want to invest in experiments in nature-based solutions. Also, all the three examples are just three things that we have done on our campus to help urban biodiversity persist. And we also want to help use the ecological observatory framework for not only understanding the changes in the biodiversity on campus as the campus develops and the surrounding areas also develop in I'm not using it in either positive or negative sense, but also how humans are also responding to those changes. By impact of humans on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and similarly the impact of biodiversity on humans and both in a cultural sense as well as in other ways, and use that framing to look at the whole of Bengaluru as an urban ecosystem, very complex urban ecosystem. So, and train people. We need entrepreneurs who are very good in ecological restoration in the urban sense, where they can integrate between blue and green infrastructure. And also, that urban biodiversity and urban ecology doesn't attract as much of the attention from our wildlife biologists and so on. It has never been very attractive because they like to work in areas which are far away in very biodiverse regions, Western Ghats, Eastern Himalayas and all. But with so much of urbanization happening, every piece of forest is close enough to a town or a city. And so the sooner we understand this transformation and have some solutions for managing it, we will lose a lot of biodiversity. And so I think that we need to train a whole generation of folks who know about nature-based solutions, who know about ecological restoration in the urban context, and hopefully make our cities still have all this biodiversity and maybe even attract new biodiversity a few decades from now. So that in some sense is the goal of the long-term urban ecological observatory. The second question was about omitting, I think there was limited time. There was a series of conventions and frameworks that India's environmental policies and all are engaging with. And so that get left out, but it's a very important one. Then I think the third one was about the
linear infrastructure.
Yes, so linear infrastructure, I gave few examples of linear infrastructure which are transforming our rivers or water bodies and so on. So at a finer scale, yes, a water pipeline, or if you take water from one part, any part, whether it's from groundwater or from a nearby river, you're going to have some impact of the other. The thing is that with urban water uses, that we not only take clean water from elsewhere, we also transform it into dirty water and put it somewhere. So if we can, at least a large portion of that water gets treated well enough, it can perhaps be the basis for rejuvenation of some of our wetlands and systems in the future. See, we cannot have a system which is not regulated, or it's going to always be regulated and complex because of human demand for water. But we can work with nature and help nature recover by investing in use of treated wastewater in many ways. I think that Bengaluru and Karnataka has been experimenting with this. And since cities produce so much of wastewater, we'll have to deal with it. We'll have to find solutions to use that water so that it also has ecological benefits in the future.
from the online audience before we move back to our in-person audience. Sachin asks, I have an 8-acre farm. We are fencing it to save our chana crop from incursions by wild pigs and nilgai-like species called rohi in our region around Nagpur. Are there any studies and some quick findings that you can share about the impact of these fences on movement of animals in an agri environment like central India?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, nilgais and wild pigs can be pretty devastating to crops. So I can imagine that many people may not want these animals to come into your farm and so on. But they are also found, they also are adapting very well to agricultural areas. And so the large populations of nilgai and wild pig do persist in these agricultural landscapes. And so it will have to be some form of coexistence because you really don't want to completely have an agricultural landscape which is bereft of some of this. But the costs are being paid sometimes by very poor farmers. And so if we can have help, in some sense, have crop insurance, we have other support for them. I think that, and then also some states have, it's controversial, but they also have some ways of, removal or culling of some of these species. And I'm not siding with one side or the other, but I'm just saying these are the options which are being exercised by some of the state governments.
A little to comment on organic farming. I'm from Sikkim. So I think when it comes to talking about fully organic, so are we talking about just the production or the consumption? Because in Sikkim, we are fully organic, everything is organic. But then when it comes to our consumption pattern, because the state cannot produce surplus amount of food grains or anything to consume, we export the inorganic produce. So that is where the whole picture of organic stands. So I have a question, sir, like you talked a lot about urban spaces, the river system, the perennial rivers. What is your stance on non-perennial rivers or the seasonal streams or first order streams that do not make way to rivers? What's your take on ecosystem services of this stream?
Yeah, so actually these seasonal streams, so many of them, dry up by November, December. Sometimes they flow up to January, and then you have a period when there is no water actually flowing in there. But in subhumid and semi-arid areas, that is the nature of the streams. And they actually perform a very important role. In the monsoon, they mobilize a lot of nutrients and sediment and transport it because, they can be very fast flowing during the monsoon season. So they perform a very important ecological role and transfer things from upstream to downstream. And they also provide habitat in that period for many species of amphibians and even fish before they can find their way into more permanent water bodies. So and also they're very important habitats because even though water is not flowing in the stream, if you actually dig a little deeper, you will find subsoil moisture and others. You will find that many of our really magnificent riparian trees, many terminalias, jamuns, and all of they sometimes grow along these riparian areas, which even though the stream itself may not be flowing throughout the dry season.
A few more questions online. Professor Jagannatha again asks, infiltration, are you considering the simple soil permeability or transport from the tree roots? They also have a couple of more questions. Should I just combine them?
Yeah.
The second question that they have is, should we seriously look at water is always integrated in SDGs 6, 11, 13? Compliance is the question. And another question they have is, on interlinking rivers, do you think the arguments will be stronger only if the frequency of droughts and floods are focused based on UNCC, IPCC, Feb 2022 and related scientific report within India?
Yeah, so I'll address the last part. So for example, if the interlinking of rivers happens the way it has been planned, so there's a study which has just found out that 40 to 50% of the sediment which is coming into the Sundarbans, into many of the most important deltas, will be cut down. So you really don't want to, already that particular region is under sea level rise and so on. So the impact of interlinking of rivers on sediment flows, the health of our delta and estuary ecosystems, low-lying areas, coastal areas, it needs to be considered. And so we need to understand river dynamics better before trying to transform them. And that decision is then left to the political establishment. But clearly, there is a lot of evidence that we have to tread with caution. And then on the permeability, yeah, we measure infiltration at different depths in the soil. We also have equipment for measuring the soil moisture depletion at different depths, so that as the tree roots are absorbing subsoil moisture, that gets the sensor picks it up. And then directly on the trees, we have sap flux sensors, which can measure the sap flux through the xylem. And so you have these three ways of understanding the transpiration.
So I wanted your opinion on the policy or structural entities and nonprofits in Bangalore with respect to freshwater ecosystems compared to other parts of India or the world.
Well, I think that Bengaluru saw quite a bit of action and mobilization of citizens around lake conservation. There was also a project called there was a Lake Development Authority set up. So you saw a lot of interest around water bodies. But I think that that the different stakeholders have different views on what that water, what should be the ecosystem services for which that particular water, wetland or water body should be revived and conserved for and managed. And I think that there could be differences. I mean, you could be wanting to, if you maximize water levels, water storage, you're not going to have a lot of diversity in water plants and biodiversity. So in fact, Hebbal Lake, when it was first filled partially, it was the number of bird species that came in the first few years before the lake levels went up was remarkable. So there is going to be a trade-off between the amount of water you store, the type of habitats you will have, plus also are they going to then also have artisanal fisheries? You're going to have aesthetics, or is it, so there's so many stakeholders are there for cultural and other reasons. And so I think if you can find some way of catering to all of these and providing cultural and aesthetic benefits to a wider section of society, then I think that our lake conservation model would be called successful. And I think we're still not reached there.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. And we ended on a very hopeful note and were followed by two questions. So my question is similar, but a case-based question. So a movement like that happened at RA, and one of the arguments done by the government or the ruling body was RA is not a forest, because our definitions of forest are so colonial and loosely based. How do you define forest in an urban, urban systems, and how do you suggest those boundaries? What is a forest and what is not? And if it's not forest, if it's eco-sensitive zone, how do we decide that what is worth conserving? I mean, because that is what exactly happened. And even though there was an entire protest and the entire regression and all of that, but still the development happened because we don't have a reservations called as eco-sensitive zone, like we have coastal zones where we are not allowed to build. So what is your take on that?
See, we have more than 20% of India is under the control of the Forest Department. And it's called the Forest Department. It's not called the Ecological or Ecosystems Department of India. It's tree-centric. It's forest-centric. Whereas many of our ecosystems are savannas, are shrublands, are scrublands, and they harbor unique biodiversity and also wetlands. All of this actually, comes under this category of so-called forest. Not all of them are really tree dominated. And so in urban spaces, even some of the species I showed, like the Eurasian kestrel, they need open spaces. They need Hesargata grasslands are very important for Bengaluru's bird. I think if we lose places like Hesargata, we'll make a big dent in Bengaluru's bird diversity. So I think that we have to get away from this tree-centric view of habitats everywhere, not just in urban context, but elsewhere. And even if you see it, if you see an empty plot of land which has not been built over, you see the number of birds that are actually, using nesting material from there, feeding there, foraging there and all. And once that goes, you see it. So open areas with shrubs, grasses, herbs, not necessarily always trees, are going to be very important for urban biodiversity. And I think we need to really think about how we can bring these into a higher profile. Yeah, that is ultimately for the citizens of Mumbai to translate that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to get into that, how it happened. But I mean, RA, yeah.
Couple of questions online regarding invasive species.
Yeah.
So one is that, is it a good idea to replace invasive species like lantana or prosopis with indigenous tree species like neem? And the other question is, I want to understand the invasive species and how to deal with them in national parks and other protected areas.
So as I said, invasive species are a slightly complex issue. For example, in the bunny grasslands, the Prosopis juliflora has become well established. There is a local economy of making charcoal from Prosopis. So some of the people who used to be cattle herders, they have shifted to charcoal economy. So now they have a stake in the invasive species. So even if the ecologists want that we should get back the pristine grassland and so on, I mean, it's not, if you look at it as a social ecological system, it has actually transformed. It's invasive species, Prosopis is now part of the local economy. So yes, we need to create more grassland patches. We need to do that transformation, but we also have to think about any of the stakeholders who have now started adapting to, or even benefiting from in this case, Prosopis. But lantana is a different issue. Lantana of course, you can make use of lantana for making furniture and other things, but it's spread over such large areas that the use of lantana for making useful products is in some sense our adaptation to the widespread availability of lantana. Whereas only ecological restoration experiments with clearing lantana, planting and grasses and trying to keep that going in smaller patches might help us with converting some of the areas under lantana into more biodiversity rich or more ecologically beneficial areas. So we have to live with invasive species. We'll have to regulate and manage them. I think it's practically impossible to get rid of all of them.
Online audience. So one of them is the role of linear infrastructure and aggravation of our ecosystem as an eye-opener. What are some alternatives at a regional level infra design? The second question is, hydrologically, the lake systems need to be dredged periodically to rejuvenate their capacity to hold water. Mm-hmm. What is the ecologically sound way to do this? And the third question is, for the riverine transport, if the boats are run by electrical motors, will it be beneficial?
Yeah, so the first one is about the linear infrastructure. And I think what was the... Yeah, so that, the same ministers who were talking about how the people who are filing court cases against these national highways has also now said that look at how national highway has this mitigation structure, and you have these tigers which are passing under them and taking pride in that, right? So you have so now there is some hope that mitigation structures where you have connectivity across so that ecosystems are not completely disconnected from each other, forest patches, that is also a form of infrastructure, but which is helping to reduce the negative impacts of. So we need entrepreneurs and we need to have investment, and any linear infrastructure project has to take into account the budget for investment in these mitigation measures. And they have only been done in a few places, for example, between Kana and Painch and a few other places. for elephant, for tigers and other mammals, and then some other places there are possibility, like in Rajaji near Dehradun, possibly to benefit elephants. But it's a small part of a very huge problem, and so, but still some hope. And over that, I think the dredging part, yes, lakes, you may have to dredge part of it, but you have to think about what's there in that sediment and where are you going to put that sediment, because that sediment may have contain high levels of toxic and other, urban areas, they generate all sorts of, new chemicals. The type of products we use in our houses these days are very different from what was used 30, 40 years back. All of that might end up in the sediment of a lake. So we need to be careful about dredging it, how we are going to use that. And we are not ruling it out. Yes, you may want to use a safe, managed dredging as part of the solution.
What if boats run by electric?
Yeah, I'm not sure about how feasible the electric part and how much noise they generate. If I get data on that, and if we can experiment with that and see the response of river dolphins to that, I think that we will then have the evidence in order to make a meaningful decision.
So much for that talk. Thank you everyone for attending, even everyone online. Thank you.
Thank you.